Today we're in the second part of a series called Investors and Consumers. If you're visiting for the first time, I'll just go ahead and let you know it's a teaching series. It's a lot of information that we're walking through, and as I explained it last week, it's a why and because teaching series. We're specifically looking at the system that God put in place when it came to our money, our resources, our primary resources, money and time, and we're focusing specifically on money. So if you've had any issues with that churches before, you're probably thinking this is the worst possible day to visit our church. But just to let you know, you can go back to listen to kind of how we approach things last week. I never ask people to do anything specific when it comes to money. We do not try to manipulate you. There's no special offering happening at the end of this after I twist your heartstrings a little bit. We're not doing that. So just to let you know, again, the heart behind the series is a why and because. Anytime your religion becomes just simply a practice of rules and expectations, and you disconnect the reason, and you disconnect the why you do it, and you disconnect the relationship that should fuel it. Even Jesus said, "Are you not burdened and wore out by this?" He was very clear. This is not the intention of even what God planned when He gave us His law, when He gave us ordinances, when He gave us expectations, when He gave us ideals to follow. It was for our good. It was for our benefit. So that's how we approach even this discussion. We're using the words investors and consumers because these are words we use most often as we talk about this. I'm going to put my little and sign up. I forgot to do that earlier. There we go. And sign. Investors and consumers. Here's our definition. Brief, kind of a couple words just to see. For invest is to devote or gain. It's to devote and put aside and set apart with an experience or an expectation tied to it. There's some growing, there's some gaining involved in that. Consume is just to use up and destroy. Think about all the financial ways we use the word invest. And really consume, we use it the same thing. Money, time. You use up all your time, use up all your money. Consume, destroy, eliminate. I love that you killed that plate of nachos, man. That was awesome. So we use these words, our most common language, and that's why we wanted to use it in terms of even understanding a system that God created when it came to our resources, our most valuable and precious resources. So the words that churches often use, as we've been talking about the last few weeks, first fruits, tithes, and offerings. Nobody else really uses these words, but first fruits, tithes, and offerings, we talked a little bit last week. We'll talk more next week to kind of break down the terminology about what these mean. But in the big picture, they really had a lot to do, when you read God's Word, they had a lot to do with whether or not someone's experiencing an outcome. We're all outcome-based people. And it was whether or not they were experiencing an outcome of a life that they felt like was blessed or cursed. And there's a lot in Scripture in terms of God promising blessing, and there's even more when it talks about people experiencing blessing from God. But there's also lots of examples where God's people were experiencing, life just wasn't going the way they thought it should go, and then it took a king or a prophet to come along and basically explain to them, look, you guys are living under a curse. You guys are living a cursed life. Now, this curse was not always something that was just God kind of against them. It was the fact that they had a better idea, they had a better way, they stopped living in the system that God created, they created their own system, and stuff just wouldn't work out. Last week we read a couple examples of even some things that we would kind of use as terminology, like my purse just seems to have holes in it. That's kind of last week. Nothing seems, I plant all this, but I don't get all that I thought I'd get in return. This is their understanding of kind of cursing, but it wasn't so much a darkness that attacked them or was on them. It was just the absence of light. It was the absence of God from their financial stuff. There was an absence from the system that they had that God had established for them. And so for us, we just kind of want to walk through what those look like. So curse was kind of the absence of God, but blessed is when we focused on last week, because blessed, everybody wants a blessed life. Everybody wants a blessed financial experience. But we wanted to talk about blessed in the way that we believe God's word kind of teaches us. Blessing can come depending on your experience and church experience. There's kind of a prosperity theology that it's very Western in terms of its roots. But it's all this stuff about being rich and God blessing you with riches and giving so that you can get. There's a big kind of movement, and it's very Western thinking. It's really damaging right now over in Africa. It's really damaging in other parts of the world. But that's where it comes from. The problem with that thinking, that Western thinking, is that it doesn't work everywhere else in the world. But yet, what we see in the Bible that talks about what blessing means works anywhere you could possibly be. And so blessed, for us, blessed means, as we read last week, it really means enough and plenty. Now, there's a sense of satisfaction. There's a sense of peace. There's a sense of having enough. And then there's also, beyond that, the fact that there's plenty to have and there's plenty to share with others. There's plenty to give away. And so this is why it works across the board, because one of the reasons we love sending our students, our kids, to some of our global outreach partners and also even to Haiti, the reason we love sending them is because the first thing we know they're going to experience, whether you go to West Virginia or Peru or wherever you're going to go, they're going to experience a little bit of pity. Because people, it's just such a different cultural shift. And that's not a bad thing, understand. Pity's just the natural first thing they'll experience. But what we also know is they're also going to experience engaging with believers in other parts of the world that even though they don't have nearly what our children are indulged with, they're happy. And they're blessed. And it's enough for them. And they're willing to share, and they're willing to give to others. And that's one of the greatest things about even sending some of our kids on these experiences is that they get to see what blessing really looks like across the board, not just the way Westerners kind of think blessed means. And so we talked a lot about that last week. Now, this was a verse that Jesus gave his disciples, and this was using some of the terminology that we were using in terms of investing and consuming. And this is where he said, don't store up, this is in Matthew 6, don't store up treasures, invest here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. He says, don't store it up there, invest your treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. And he says, and wherever your treasure is, there your desires of your heart will be also. Jesus was very, very, just in the way that only God can, he kind of reveals in the statement that there is a string, right, attached to your resources, your primary resources, which people view as money. And they say there's a string to that and where your heart is. It's such a personal thing. So last week we even read in Malachi where God says to test him, try the system that he created. Why don't we do that? Well, the reason we said they don't do it, from Jesus' response here, is because money is the test of our hearts. Right? Money is the test of our hearts. It's so personal. Nothing alters our mood quite like our money does, right? Not quite like getting a check and all of a sudden, you know, or not getting the check you're supposed to, and you're just like, Nothing alters that, even our perception, because there's a string there. It's completely tied to our heart. Where our treasure's going to be, that's where our heart is. Where our heart is, that's where our treasure's going to be, right? So money is the test of our hearts, and we fail that test constantly when we focus on just the consuming life. So we gave these examples last week. I want to kind of break it down a little bit more this week. The money's a test of our hearts, but there's a lens by which we view things. Now, illustrations fall apart at all sorts of levels, so I'm going to use it a couple different ways today. But just know that I'm giving you these visuals so you'll have something in mind. We talked about there's a system for investing and consuming that God created both. But that investing really does kind of represent this kind of like long-term view, this understanding, this more clarity. And a telescopic view it takes things that are large and it brings it in close, right? So here's an example of that. Like you can take a look at the telescope and you can look outside and see the moon, right? Just unbelievable distance away and so big. And it's like, but it takes something like that and it brings it in. It brings it into closer to us, makes it feel a little more closer to where I am. And it brings it into clarity, brings it sometimes into view. That's what the lens of our heart, kind of telescopic lens of our heart does. But we also have a tendency to have a microscopic view, right? A microscopic view where everything that's small gets blown up, right? Everything that's tiny, everything that's urgent kind of gets blown up and blown out of proportion. So if you remember high school or middle school, you guys don't know what this is? This is like blood, right? These are blood cells, right? I know it's not as clear as some other ones, but this I think is like 10 or 15 magnification. It's blood cells, right? So it's this idea that we could take something that you wouldn't normally see and we could blow it on up so you can see it. Now, this one's really, I didn't want to gross anybody out too much, but does anybody know what this is? Right? Does anybody know? Shout it out. It's dust. Right? That's dust. Now, dust, we don't normally see dust, right, till it's after it's collected for a little while on one of our, surfaces. We don't see dust till it's collected. And this is a microscopic view of dust, where everything that's something so small you can't really even see individually can be seen. It just gets blown up, and it just looks, all I could think of was like, the ball pit at Chuck E. Cheese after like a preschool party. That's what I thought of right there, right? Isn't that gross? But that is in terms of our lives, I want to kind of walk through today just these two views, these two lenses of our hearts, and how it drives us when it comes to our behavior. And what drives some of our behavior when it comes to this idea of giving and generosity and investing. The question itself today that we're dealing with is, why don't we give, right? Last week we talked about why we give in terms of understanding the because and why has God laid it out. But I want to talk today about just why don't we give? And how does God answer that question for us? And does he know, does he understand, right, why it is that we struggle? Now there's lots of things, and I can't even touch all of them today. I'm going to go to some root causes today, and it plays itself out differently in everyone's life. There's a lot of things, hang-ups that people have when it comes to generosity. But why don't we give? This is the big picture. And so I'm going to read this passage from Luke. This is another passage, another time where Jesus is kind of giving some instruction to his disciples of just about the system, the orderly system that God really does kind of represent. That God is not a God of chaos or randomness. It's very orderly. It's very systematic. And so he's kind of explaining it, and he's giving them some universal principles to follow. And so, and this will kind of talk us about why we struggle, why we don't give. Here's where Luke 6 says, "Do not judge others, and you will not be judged." Right? "Do not condemn others, or will all come back against you. Forgive others, and you will be forgiven. Give, and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap." And he ends this time by saying, "The amount you give will determine the amount you get back." Let's just read this verse together out loud. Everybody in the room, you ready? "The amount you give will determine the amount you get back." Let's just read it one more time, all out loud. Ready? "The amount you give will determine the amount you get back." And again, this is just a principle. This is a verse about principles that God is, even Jesus is saying, look, it doesn't just apply to one thing. This is just a principle of what God created. That you need to understand that there's if you invest wisely, you will receive wisely. If you invest poorly, you receive. If just walk with me. If you forgive others, you will be what? Forgiven, right? However, if you judge others, you will be what? Judged. Now let me tell you why. Again, this is kind of walking today. One of the reasons we can see with clarity things that they may seem far off is the idea of just investing. For you and for me, it's such a necessary thing, but it really is a lens of faith. That's kind of how we're going to determine it. It's a lens of faith versus what I would call kind of a lens of fear, where for a microscopic view, we really can't see how our actions, right, how our actions affect us because we're so focused in and so fearful of all that we see in front of us. It's kind of overwhelming, and we're obsessed over it. It's overwhelmed. It's all blown out of proportion. It's the urgency. It's the now. And we can't see, that's the problem, we can't see how our actions, because of this, dictate and determine what we will actually receive and get back. And so we get stuck. And so the answer is very simple. If you just want to kind of get down to the bottom of the answer, it's why don't we give? And the answer is fear. Let me just quickly say this. One of the things I love is that when it comes to the principles of God, there's something called common grace. I don't know if you guys knew this or not. There's something called common grace. And common grace basically says this. When you do the things that Jesus talked about, when you don't judge others, you actually will not be judged. It doesn't actually matter whether you're a Christian or not. This is a common thing. This is a systematic God that created the universe, that put these things into place, and that's the way it works, regardless whether you acknowledge or not. There are businesses, and this is the part that I love. There are businesses that follow the golden rule. There are businesses that take some of the teachings of Jesus. There are Jewish businesses that just follow the Old Testament and put some of those things into practice, and they experience blessing. And they experience success, and they experience some of the common grace of putting those things into practice, whether they acknowledge God or not. One of the guys I follow that doesn't claim in terms of being a Christian is Tony Robbins. And Tony Robbins is kind of a motivational guy. He has some spirituality wording and things mixed into his kind of destiny things that he does. But the reality is I love the fact that Tony is very clear when you hear him talk about it. He talks about a giving culture in his own life. A giving culture. And he talks about the importance of what it looks like to have a giving culture in your own life in order to experience any of the success that could possibly come your way. And people, he talks to business owners and basically are like, well, one day I will, and one day I might, and he basically says, look, if you can't give $10, if you can't give $10 out of 100, you will never give $100,000 out of $1 million, ever. He says you have to have a giving culture. And he doesn't acknowledge God in that. He doesn't acknowledge he follows 10%, which is hilarious. He doesn't acknowledge tithe or any of the words the church does. But it's a common grace. It's an understanding that this systematic understanding is so real in our society, and yet Christians who have the key to the understanding, Christians who have a basis for not just a common grace, but a very individualized grace in your life and a blessing in your life, we still struggle to have a giving culture, to understand why we don't give, and it's fear. Fear is the thing that drives our actions, right? Fear drives our actions, fear drives our decisions, and fear is what drives us from being able to understand that judgment that I'm going to lay down really quickly is going to return to me. Because I'm so focused on the here and the now and the present. Matter of fact, I love this quote. This is from the book that I'm going to mention in a little bit. It says, the fear that drives us toward what matters now drives us away from what matters most. That fear in us that drives us to the urgency of the now, to focus so hard on what is right now, is the same fear that keeps us from focusing on what matters most in our life. And it's fear. Again, fear is the thing that drives the decisions in our life. Now, in order to kind of get to the root of this, I'm going to talk about 3 things that actually motivate fear when it comes to money. When it comes to money and giving in that generosity culture and how it works with these 2 views, I want to talk about the things that drive fear and therefore drive the decisions that we make, right? That drives the outcomes that we're not experiencing or that we are experiencing in our life. And let's walk through these 3 things as we kind of meet and think through how God kind of designed this. The first one is the selfishness, right? Fear driven by selfishness. One of the first fears we're going to talk about is the one that's driven by selfishness. And I'm going to read through this passage in Deuteronomy because the passage for me is kind of, God is explaining the law. Again, people don't like reading the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, because like, oh, it's all these old rules, it's so weird. And I'm like, I understand, but it's a lot of the why and because, right? It's a lot of really rich information about the why and because God set the system up for his people to be free. This was a freedom. The law that was given was for freedom. And so I love reading it sometimes because it just kind of unveils, and God is so clever to be able to just walk right into what people haven't even fully experienced yet, but he kind of plays it out for you. As he explains the law, he plays it out what's going to happen. So I'm going to read through this passage in Deuteronomy. But before we get there, this fear that's driven by selfishness, you know, a lot of adults would not claim to be selfish, okay? That's one thing that we struggle with. We wouldn't probably call our own heart and the lens of our heart selfish and don't understand the fear, therefore, that drives some of our behavior. But the reality is it's true. Now, we all see it. Now, if you're between 25 and 45, you see it in children, right? Children is what you see it. You determine selfishness by looking at the toddler, and he's got all the toys around him, and somebody comes to take the toy, and what's the toddler say? Mine! Right? Because there's an absolute sense of ownership, and it's mine. Why would you dare take it? And yet, we see it from adults looking down. We understand the selfishness there. We see it. I mean, I have to tell my children all the time, and I have 3 kids now. My youngest is going to hear this so much more often. My children don't understand. I tell them all the time, you own nothing, right? You're technically homeless, too. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like my children, I mean, as a father looking down, like everything you have has been provided for you. Everything. You have nothing. Dad, I have some money. No, because I can take it away immediately. And if I can take it away, you don't have it, right? So, I mean, I want even my kids to see and understand it, but as adults, something happens, right? Something changes in our perspective, and all of a sudden our perspective becomes, we become owners. We become owners. It's all mine. It's a misunderstanding of the responsibility that we've had. And yet I believe God looks down as the Heavenly Father and looks at all of us and just laughs. You own nothing, right? You are all technically homeless people. Outside of the grace of God, outside of the provision of God, we have nothing. And that's sometimes hard for adults to get because our version of selfishness is what drives our fear. That if we don't look out for us, if we don't have our focus on us, everything that comes our way that just gets blown out of proportion, we have to understand is driving a fear in us that keeps us from being able to invest, keeps us able to give, keeps us from being able to be generous. And so as we go into this passage in Deuteronomy, I just want you to see, again, as God kind of explains it out for us, what happens and how this works. The selfishness, fear driven by selfishness. If anyone is poor among you, this is Deuteronomy 15, among your fellow Israelites, among you, in any of the towns that the land the Lord your God has given you, do not be, what's the 2 words? Hard-hearted, or what's the word? Tight-fisted toward them. Okay, that's the adult versions of selfishness, right? Hard-hearted and tight-fisted. It says, rather be, what's the word? Open-handed. And what's the word? Freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. Now, here, watch this. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near. So that you do not show ill will towards the needy among you and your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. Right? He goes on to say, they may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Let me walk you through what this is. This is a system that we don't understand. Right? This is something God created in his system, is that there was an opportunity to lend and borrow and things like that. But God had it built in at a certain time frame. Look, every once in a while, there's going to be this year of release that you're going to have to release all debts. You're going to have to release all debts, pay you nothing. And so here God is walking him through the law, walking him through his commands, and says, look, I know how it's going to work out, right? You're going to be 6 months out from the year of release, and your mind, this wicked thought, this selfish thought, is going to come in and go, man, if they can't pay that back, I ain't going to get nothing. So I'm not going to give them anything. I will not lend to them. Therefore, the fear, that selfishness that drives that fear, will cause us to take actions that actually we will be guilty of sin at that point. Guilty of sin in terms of how they looked at it. And so for us, I want you to hear this. Even he said the wicked thought. The wicked thought is just that selfish thought that comes because we're so focused in on the here and the now and the urgent and what's what's important now instead of what matters more or what matters most. And so the selfishness that comes up, I'm not saying that the temptation to be selfish always happens. The first thought I always have is selfish. Can I get an amen at all? The first thought I always have is selfish. It's the second and third thought that matter, right? It's what I actually allow to drive my decisions and behaviors. But if that selfishness basically just only drives fear, then my fear of who's going to look out for me, who's going to take care of me, when's it going to be my turn, that fear of that selfishness that drives that fear is going to cause us to not do what God's called us to do. Even from the basic tendencies, like we talked about last week, even from the basic understanding of God's provided everything for you, you're living as an imposter when you think that you own all that you have. I've set apart a certain amount to be returned back to God. Even in that moment, selfishness will drive us to not do what he's asked us to do. They'll drive that fear, and that fear will drive our behavior. Here's the second one I want to talk about today. This is fear driven by loss. Fear driven by loss. Let's continue the passage in Deuteronomy. You shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be, what's the word? Grieved when you give to him, right? You should not be grieved because for this thing I'm asking you to do, this release of what I've given you and how I've blessed you, for this thing you're going to do, the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and in all in which you put your hand to, right? He's like, look, why would you fear this? Why would you see this as lost? Don't grieve this when you give it away. I'm God. When you do what I've asked you to do, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless what you put your hands to. I'm going to bless you in all the ways in enough and plenty that we've already talked about. That's what I'm going to do. The one who's given everything to you will continue to give everything to you. Why in the world would you view it as loss? And that's hard for us. I know a lot of us don't really see that loss. Maybe you've experienced it when somebody's come out of the blue and asked you for a handout. You know, and all you got's a 5, and you could have given them your 5, and you're like, ugh. Because you just feel, you grieve that process. Here's where it really shows up. Let me just show you where it really shows up. And this is all for our married people in the room, okay? If you're not married, just pay attention. Write it down, okay? Couples fight about money all the time. It's one of the biggest areas of marriage struggle is finances. And they don't actually fully understand what drives those fights and what drives that issue. And I'm telling you, one of them is that there's a fear driven by loss. And because every time she spends money, guess what he does? He groans, right? Sometimes even out loud. And every time he spends money, she groans. Why do we need another gun? Right? I'll pick on the gun owners, sorry. Maybe it's a tablet. I don't know what your deal is, right? Maybe it's another grill. I don't know everybody's individual taste. You know? The man's groaning. How many shoes? I can't build another house for your shoes. Right? I mean, like, but understand, they don't understand that this is a groaning and a grieving that's you feel like it's a loss. And yet God built the whole system of consumption in. Now, I'm not telling you to be foolish with your funds. Understand, I'm not telling you to be foolish with it. I'm telling you that when it comes to being generous, when it comes to giving away, there's this loss attitude is a fear. It's a fear in us that will keep us from releasing anything in our hands. You know? When we get stuck in this microscopic view, what comes to me is for me, right? Versus what comes to me, I'm responsible for. I'm a steward of. Does that make sense? And so he says, don't grieve it. Don't view it as a loss. We'll keep going. There's a fear that's driven by the unknown. Right? There's a fear that's driven by just the unknown in our life. I want to skip down to, skip over actually to a verse in 2 Corinthians, which is Paul writing, because I love this in terms of how he describes what's unknown in our life, in terms of what we have fear over. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 4. This is Paul. This is why we never give up, okay, persist. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. And then he goes on to talk about this. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long. Yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever, right? He goes on, so we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on the things that cannot be seen. He goes, for the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. I mean, this lens, right? This lens that gives us clarity and brings things that are far away up close. This lens of faith that we have, right? This lens is freedom for us from the unknown, right? It's freedom. Because when we are so fixed, again, on this microscopic view, this view of fear, this lens of fear in our hearts and lives, we can't see it because everything is unknown. Only what we have current, the troubles and challenges we have today, are the things we can see. So we fear everything else. We can't remember the past, and we can't know the future, and we're consumed by the present because of the fear of the unknown. And yet, one of the things I love about the lens of faith, right, this telescopic view, it doesn't just look forward. It doesn't just look forward and give you some clarity. I mean, how much trouble is our current day trouble in light of eternity? Right, when you have that gaze fixed on the future, when you have that gaze fixed on an eternal life with God, what can I really going to worry about today, right? And here it is, this lens. It doesn't just take what's far away in the future and bring it close and give some clarity. It works the same with the past, to where we look back, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, and some of us even 30 years, and we look back and go, you know what? That was completely unknown to me, right? That was completely unknown. Look what God did. Look what God did. Well, 15 years, that was so I didn't even know where that came from. Look what God did 5 years ago. Man, that was my mistake. That was something I did. That was something stupid that I did and experienced the consequence of. But even then, look what God did. And to be able to go forward from there and go, there's no reason for me to fear the unknown. I'm going to fix my gaze, even on what I can't see. Because I know what I can see. I know who I can trust in. So the unknown has no grip on you, has no grip on you to bring this fear that will drive your behaviors, that will keep you thinking that you're the owner, keep you thinking that it's a loss, keep you thinking that it's so unknown, there's no way to plan for it, so we're just going to hunker down. I'm so overwhelmed by the now. And all those things that kind of drive our fear, that drive those behaviors, there is a solution. There is freedom, guys. There is a way in which to get past that. Why don't we give fear? There's a way to move past it. There's a key. I'm going to say this out loud. There's a key to generosity, right? There's a key to generosity. Do you want to know what the key is? Yes? Really, do you want to know what the key is? The key to generosity? Good. I'm just going to make sure you're all with me. Okay. There's a key to this. And it continues on in that verse in Deuteronomy. It continues on in that passage as he says, look, go do this. Don't worry about that. Don't grieve this. Don't be tight-fisted. Don't be hard-hearted. He goes on to say this, down in verse 14, I believe. He says, supply them liberally, again, freely, open-handedly from your flock and threshing floor and winepress. Again, this is our money. Okay, just understand money. To them, this was all what money represented in terms of resources. Give to them as the Lord, your God, has blessed you. Remember that he's the one who's blessed you. I love this word. What's this word right here? Remember. Remember that you were what? Slaves. You were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. Like, God is not apologizing, right? God's not apologizing for asking them to do these things and for commanding them to do these things and for giving them these laws that bring freedom to their life. Because he says, yeah, hey, guess what? Remember that time you were slaves? We were talking about the Seder feast earlier. It's like, that's why they did it. It was every year. Every year, they celebrated the Passover in order to remember. Remember. And in all of that, they would wake up to the discovery. And this is really the key, right? The key to generosity is gratitude. They would remember. They would remember. And guys, it doesn't have to just be grateful for what you have today. Now, understand this. If you're not a follower of Christ and you're just living in the system that God created, you can be, I'm going to get all algebra on you here, right? There's equal sign in the middle. You can be grateful for what you have and then be generous in proportion to how grateful you are, right? I mean, you can be, there's just something that works there for everybody. It doesn't really matter who it is. If you've been blessed and you feel, you've been given a lot, you can be grateful and you can have a giving culture in your spirit and it can be about the same. But then you're going to reach a threshold. You're going to reach a threshold where giving anymore is just foolish. Giving anymore is just dumb. Releasing anymore is just not a good idea. That's not wise. And yet for the follower of Christ, for the believer, we're able to go so much further down this road of gratitude because we're able to not just go, hey, I'm so grateful for what I have today. Look what he gave me all my life. Look at this. Look at this time in my life. Look at this. Look at what it was like before God, right? Look at what my life was like before I had freedom. Look at what my life was before I had grace. He has so freely given me grace and love and peace and joy and hope. How could I not, on the other side, be extraordinarily generous with everything that he's given me? We have so much further that we can go than someone who doesn't follow God. We look at all that and say, look, the key to this, the key to unlocking this, crushing the fear that would cause me to sin, crushing the fear that keeps me from living in the system that God created me of blessing, crushing that fear and unlocking this, that the test of our hearts is gratitude. Gratitude. I want to read from this, I want to tell you about this book. This is a book called Fields of Gold by Andy Stanley. I love this book. It's a really short read. He focuses on a set of verses in 2 Corinthians 9 that has a lot of imagery about the farmer and the seed and the sower. And I would just encourage you, if you've ever wanted to kind of dive deep and read a little bit more, I bought like 25 or whatever of these books, and they're on the middle table in the lobby just to give away to you. So if you would love to read it, it's out there for you. Please take one to read. Bring it back. Give it to a friend if you're done. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal book. And it talks a lot about this understanding of the system and how fear can be overcome. But I love this in terms of gratitude because he talks about gratitude in this too. But I want to take you through the passage in 2 Corinthians. This is actually 2 Corinthians 9. Remember, right? The word, remember, gratitude. Remember this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will reap generously. Again, this is a very systematic verse. And then he goes on to say, each man should give what he's decided in his heart. Paul's addressing people in the church that are giving money, to give not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, a grateful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Again, a lot of the same language you'll read in the Old Testament in terms of blessing. Right? He says, look, he's able. He's able to do it because he's already created the system for it. And then he goes on to say, as it is written, he has scattered abroad his gifts to the poor, and his righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies the seed of the sower and the bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge your harvest the harvest of your righteousness. And then it goes on to say, and you will be made rich in every way. And that's usually, again, where the prosperity theology ends the verse and goes, yeah, let's sing and pass the plate, right? You're going to be rich in every way. But why? Why would he do all that? Why would he increase your seed? Why would he give you more? Why would he bless you with more? And this is, the heart of the verse. Be rich in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in, what's the word? Thanksgiving to God. That there's this, not just the generosity, gratitude doesn't just unlock generosity. Generosity produces gratitude. That's just the way it is. We say around here that we have a core ambition of hope. We say leading people to hope, or leading brings hope, because it doesn't just bring hope to somebody else. Every time I lead someone towards hope, I receive hope. I get infused with hope in return. It's a very similar process. It's like this idea, look, you can crush this fear. You can live this life. You can release that thing that you have a hold of, and that has a hold on you, this fear, with gratitude. And the more more gratitude you feel, and the more generous you become, it will do nothing more than produce more gratitude in your life and the life of those around you. Produce nothing but more thankfulness, more thanksgiving to God, to bless you, so that you can continually bless others. This is the system that God created from Genesis 12, right? To bless, I'm going to bless you, Abraham, so that you can be a blessing to the world. That's what he created. It's why he created it. It's not a give to get, just tit for tat ideology. We give so that we can have more opportunity to give. We release so that we can have more opportunity to release. The more I release, I tell people all the time, one of the best things you do, if you feel like money has a hold on you, you need to write a big fat check. And it doesn't even need to be to this church. I'm really okay with you just writing a check to whoever you want to and wherever you want to go. Sometimes when you don't understand how much fear has played out in your decisions and how much fear has gripped you when it comes to finances and resources, some of the best things you can do is let it go. You will never understand how free you are when you let go of the things that have chains on you. And money does it. It's the test of our hearts. So that's the bottom line even for today. Just understanding money is the test of our hearts, but gratitude is the key. Gratitude is the key to crushing that fear. Remembering, right? Remembering. I'll give this quick story before we pray, but my folks were in town. My parents are, they call them snowbirds, right? So they go from Canada to Florida, right? And they go from Canada, about 6 months out of the year, 5-6 months out of the year. And whether it's, depending on whether we see them or not, they come through. They come through and see us on the way back, usually, from Florida to Canada. And this time they got to come around my birthday, which was awesome last week, so we just got to spend the day together. But it was funny, I think it was Sunday night, my wife and I were talking with my parents, and I don't want to give you the whole discussion, but it was just funny because we were kind of talking about some things. I was sharing with them about my sabbatical last year and just some ways that God was kind of reminding me of some things. And we were talking about something really specific. And I remember, I'll never forget, because it was one of those moments where my dad kind of piped in and said, and we were talking about just me, just the role that I'm in here at this church, and just continually feel blessed to be the pastor that I am to you guys. And that sometimes even sometimes when I question, I'm still kind of in disbelief. And my dad just basically said, yeah, it's because you weren't supposed to be the pastor. You weren't supposed to be where you are. That's all God. Like my dad was just very clear, like, it's all God. You need to remember. You need to remember how emphatic you were as a kid that you were never even going to work for a church, right? Like my dad remembers this. He's like, and I don't know how much it crushed my parents' heart, but I guess they just trusted God for it. He's like, no, that wasn't you. This wasn't your idea. You didn't go to seminary to prep for all this. This wasn't your dream in your life. You weren't going to do any of this. This is all God's idea. He's put you exactly where he wants to put you. And then he goes on. My dad just keeps going. He goes, you weren't even supposed to be born, right? I mean, he was as clear as he could be. The thing that mom used to protect her from not getting pregnant, God said, tough beans. And I was born. And then he even went on to talk about our move from Canada to the States and just the intricacies of how that whole visa program worked and just how God just provided a way. And sometimes I'm just telling you, the perspective of my parents who are 77 years old, being able to just kind of talk through that with me and Tracy, just brought me to another place of, again, being incredibly grateful. That God, that I can give of my entire life. I own nothing. I have nothing that's apart from you. There is nothing I should ever allow fear to drive in my life because I wasn't supposed to be born, right? I wasn't supposed to be here. God had a plan. He had a plan to move us to the States. He had a plan to move us out of that small town we were in Canada. He had a plan for my life, even as I kind of rejected a lot of promptings in my life to continue to bring me closer and closer to him, to give up my desires to go into full-time service of his ministry in the church. Never even again thinking I was going to be in the role I am today. I mean, what other response do I have than gratitude? What other response should I have and should you have when you begin to remember that you were slaves? To remember that this wasn't your plan. To remember that God has brought you to where you are. Do not let fear drive, and that selfishness and loss and unknown drive the fear even deeper to the lens of your heart to keep you from being generous, to keep you from giving all that he's called you to give. He wants you to experience blessing and freedom. And in the next couple weeks, we're going to talk more. As we talk about both of these systems, we've kind of focused on one individual one each week, but next week we're going to talk about how they come together, and we're going to talk about where actually it causes some tension. Investing and consuming causes some tension in our life, but that the tension is where the power is, and only God can do in terms of showing up in our lives to continue to move us to a place of blessing, enough, peace, satisfaction, and plenty to share. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. The way your word kind of pierces the heart and allows us to be challenged. Not in a way that's so confrontive that you want to beat us down, but in a way that confronts us because we know that we can be lifted up. We know that we can defeat the chains that are on us. We know that we can be free. We know that fear and anxiety and worry consume our sight. And God, you never planned for that. That there is a future for us that we can see with clarity through a lens of faith. And we can look back in the past and see how you've come through every time. And then God, I pray that even as that's challenged to everyone in the room today, I don't know everyone's story. God, you by your Spirit hopefully are allowing the things that everybody needed to hear individually to be heard to them and to be challenged. And God, I pray that this week, that today wouldn't just be a time of informational teaching, but that God, there is freedom awaiting those who are going to take a step and just start to flex that gratitude in their life. And they're going to start taking steps towards freedom in giving. And they're going to start taking steps towards generosity. And that, God, you are going to meet them there in a powerful way. And it's not just going to be information that tells them why, because, but God, it's going to actually begin to change their hearts and their behavior and their lives. I pray, God, for every person that applies to, that's here today, that's watching online later, that you would do something undeniable. Although it might be unexplainable, that you would do something undeniable in our hearts when it comes to our failure all the time at the test of money in us. I pray all of this, God, by your power alone. In your name, Jesus. Amen.